I'm Kate Fold. I'm director of the USC Annenberg Norman Lear Center's Hollywood Health and Society program. I know it's a mouthful. The Lear Center's overall mission is to study and shape the impact that entertainment storytelling has on audiences' knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. At Hollywood Health and Society, for over 20 years, we have worked with entertainment TV to inform and inspire accurate depictions around health, safety, and security. And for the last 5 or so years, we have worked with the industry to help them tell important and often neglected stories about the dangers of nuclear weapons. Tonight, we're going to hear how in 1946, reporter and author John Hersey uncovered the story of the Hiroshima bombing. But even before the Japanese surrendered, the US government and military began an information suppression campaign to hide the devastation of these experimental weapons and what they had wrought. They closed the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to all reporters, preventing leaks about the destruction and the long-term effects of radiation, which would go on to kill thousands. The cover-up worked for nearly a year until John Hersey came along and told the truth to the world. Leslie Bloom, author of Fallout, The Hiroshima Cover-Up, and the reporter who revealed it to the world, is with us tonight to talk about the book and about Hersey's story. Leslie is a Los Angeles-based journalist, author, and biographer. Her work has appeared in Vanity Fair, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Paris Review, among others. And her last nonfiction book, Everybody Behaves Badly, was a New York Times bestseller. Now, to help us navigate this fascinating discussion, we're delighted to have investigative journalist, author, and filmmaker Eric Schlosser join us. His books include Fast Food Nation, Reefer Madness, and Command and Control, Nuclear Weapons, the Damascus Accident, and the Illusion of Safety, which was a finalist for the 2014 Pulitzer Prize. Welcome, Leslie and Eric.
Hi, everybody. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having us. And Leslie, I'm just going to start out by saying this is a great book.
Thanks.
I'm polite. This is a great book. And what's so interesting about it for me is it's a great book about what I consider to be the greatest work of nonfiction ever written. For me, John Hersey's Hiroshima, it's my favorite nonfiction book. I read it for the first time maybe 30 years ago. I've read it 3 or 4 times since then. I've gotten so much from it each time I've read it, just how it works, how it's assembled, the beauty of its prose, and on top of how extraordinary it is as a piece of writing, it's about one of the most important subjects when he wrote it and today. There was a senator around the time of Hiroshima after the city was destroyed who said that the invention of the atomic bomb was the most important historical event since the birth of Jesus Christ. And that seems like exaggeration, but I think it's true. And so I'm really interested in hearing from you what drew you to John Hersey, what made you want to write the book, what you found out in your reporting, and why this book is not just of academic historical interest, but why the story it tells and the subject it addresses just could not be more timely and could not be more important. So just to start out, I'm curious, when did you first read Hiroshima? And when you read it, did you ever think that you'd be writing about it?
So I came to Hiroshima late. I didn't actually really know about the work until I was in my early 40s. I'm a history major. I studied history, all the way through high school, through college, through grad school. I did my master's thesis on war reporting during the Gulf War. I mean, I've been very, and my undergrad studies were all based on World War II, but mostly European theater. And so, and for some reason, I didn't read it in high school. It was just never assigned. So I didn't actually come to write Fallout. Here's the brand new paperback edition. I didn't actually come to the topic of Fallout through Hersey initially. He wasn't the entry point. I knew that I wanted my next nonfiction book to be something that really drove home the importance of investigative reporting and to make people really value our free press, because at the time I was conceiving the project or thinking about what my project was going to be at all. It was 2015 and Trump is rising unfathomably at that point. And then, we get into 2016 and suddenly journalists who are my people. I'm from a family of journalists. I married into a family of journalists. My whole world are journalists. My people are suddenly on a hit list. So my dad's boss, who was Walter Cronkite, was, the most trusted man in America. Suddenly now, people of his ilk are enemies of the people. So I was, appalled and disgusted. And I really wanted a historical story that focused on one, let's call it an act of journalism that would really drive home to the public again how deadly important reporting at its best was. And so I found my way to, in looking at World War II topics, because I've had an affinity for that forever, I found my way to Hersey's story. And to my shock, it was underexplored and there was a lot to be told. And it really made the point that I wanted to make. So I seized on that before anybody else could.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there is a quality of All the President's Men in the sense of what he's investigating is, not only an event of world historical importance, but a weapon that is surrounded by extraordinary top secrecy. I mean, the greatest secrecy imaginable. And, tell me a little bit about Hersey and as your central character, what drew you to him?
Well, I mean, you rightly point out, I mean, it was the ultimate secret project in many ways. Tens of thousands of people were working on the development of a nuclear bomb and didn't even know what they were working on. I mean, many of them found out along with the rest of the world after, we bombed Hiroshima. Hersey, so my last book was on Hemingway, who, was, also a journalist, but not like Hersey. I mean, who is, profoundly bombastic, extremely sure of his place in the world and of his eventual legacy from the time he was, 20. Hersey, on the other hand, is this wildly self-downplaying, humble, completely decent guy. I mean, he's a golden boy in many respects. Around the time that I'm profiling him, he had gone to Hotchkiss and to Yale and then to Cambridge University, and he was, incredibly popular. Doors just opened for him, even though he had been grown up as a missionary kid, or a mish kid, as he calls himself, in China. And so he's the thing that interested me about him was that, beyond the humility and the advantages that gave him, but were the feelings of being an outsider in incredibly privileged citadels of power, whether those are academic citadels and eventually, those contacts in those worlds fed into the worlds that he would cover. And in those days you really needed inner access, and he had it, but he also, because he hadn't grown up, among New York or Washington society. He was a poor kid. He was on scholarship all the way through school. He always had that feeling of being the outsider, being the observer, and it was an incredible asset. So it's access, but he's also a hover above. And that turned out to be, enormously to his advantage when he eventually reports Hiroshima. But that was, as a biographer, it was a great aspect of his personality and his situation to mine.
One of the things I really admired about him as a writer, aside from his literary gifts, was that he left his office and he went into the world.
Yeah.
And put himself again, you mentioned he may not have been wealthy, but he traveled in incredibly privileged circles, and he could have had a very comfortable life and a very safe one.
Yeah.
But when war breaks out, he puts himself in the middle of it. Maybe if you can tell us a little bit about what his reporting was like prior to trying to investigate Hiroshima. What kinds of situations was he exploring, and where was he going?
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the few examples where an early career is actually really interesting. And he, as you said, could have had this life of totally cushy glamour. He had married a Southern heiress. They lived on Park Avenue. I mean, he could have just played tennis and kind of phoned it in and lived in the lap of luxury, and Century Clubbed it up. But instead, he did, as you said, it started in 1939. He became a war correspondent, and he was then at
one interruption. And I'm sorry, that might be a dog. I'm just curious, how old is he?
He's a baby. He's in his late 20s when World War
In
II.
his late 20s, he gives up Park Avenue to go to war.
Well, I mean, look, yes, and that's exceptional, commendable, the works, but everybody did go also. I mean, it was if you weren't going as a correspondent, you were likely going to be drafted. And there was,
not John Wayne.
Well, with some exceptions.
Yeah.
We'll get to this later in the conversation, but his eventual home in my book is the New Yorker instead of Time. And there was this great anecdote about how the New Yorker editors are watching their staffers numbers dwindle because they're all being drafted over to Europe. And even Truman Capote at one point had apparently been under consideration, and his bosses thought he'd been drafted, and one day he just turns up at work again, and they say, Truman, what are you doing here? We thought you got drafted. And he said, nobody would take me, not in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. So it was, everybody, with the exception of, John Wayne and Truman Capote, had gone over. Hersey, he did try to, I need to go back and look at the research, but he wanted to go in as an enlisted man, but instead he went in as a war correspondent. And he covered many different theaters of war. I mean, he saw everything during that 6-year period, from concentration camps to conflict, and it had an incredible impact on him. And I honestly don't know how he and members of his generation could have seen the things that they saw and come out of that conflict optimistic. But Hersey, he had 4 kids, through the course of his life. And how do you do that if you don't have some hope for humanity in the world? He was a commended war hero. When he had been covering a battle in the Solomon Islands, he had helped evacuate a wounded Marine, and he, helped. He later said that he did it to help get himself the hell out of there because it had been such a dangerous situation, and wished he had the guts to give back the medal, but nevertheless he got it. He had many extraordinary successes, literarily, is that a word? And journalistically during that period of time. Also, he wrote a book that profiled General MacArthur and his troops, that was very laudatory and did extremely well. He wrote a war novel that won him the Pulitzer Prize, called A Bell for Adano, which was actually quite a nasty, veiled portrait of another general in the European theater at that time. So to say that he's making his way through World War II with enormous successes is pretty much an understatement. I mean, it makes his career, it makes his celebrity in some respects, but he's not comfortable with it. Again, this was interesting to me and attractive to me as a biographer and as a person. And he's actually under heavy consideration by Henry Luce, who's then the head of Time Inc., to become Henry Luce's heir apparent. But as Hersey is seeing more of the world and becoming more humanist in his approach because of all the horrors that he's seen, he sees Luce and his then managing editor going the direction of being extremely bombastic, patriotic in a disturbingly conservative way, deeply combative with the Russians. And Hersey eventually walks away from Luce and his opportunity to be the heir apparent to this burgeoning empire. And so instead of being the heir to time, he is a freelancer by the end of World War II. So again, he's always following his own moral compass. And again, it's another situation where he's being offered everything, and he goes with what he feels comfortable with instead.
And what he feels comfortable with, I mean, as a character, what's so interesting is he's choosing a more difficult path.
Yeah.
He has this extraordinary success, and rather than coast on this success, he keeps on putting himself in harm's way and putting himself, where the story is, but, not, I mean, really, really important stories. And how does he cross paths with John F. Kennedy and with one of John F. Kennedy's ex-girlfriends? How does that factor? Again, it just adds to the extraordinary qualities of this character.
But it also shows you the circles in which he ran, right? I mean, because Kennedy's obviously to the manor born, and Hersey's not, but he's in that world. So Hersey's first wife had actually been a lover of, or a paramour, let's say, of Kennedy's before Hersey, but they had remained friendly. So one night, Hersey and his then wife, and they're in a nightclub in New York. The exact nightclub is not. Is a matter of debate, and they're with John F. Kennedy, who has just come back from the Pacific, and he's just had his U-boat ordeal, and he told Hersey the story of what had happened to him. The U-boat had been seared in half by a Japanese destroyer, and how he had to personally help rescue some of his fellow crew members. And Hersey, I mean, he's a newsman. He's like, that's a hell of a story, even if you're not an ambassador's son, and you are. And this is this, I want this story on exclusive. So originally he takes that story to Time Inc., to Life, and they reject it, astonishingly. And so he then somehow was able to bring it to the New Yorker and write it for the New Yorker instead. So Time Inc. in its way inadvertently sort of rejected Hersey over into the New Yorker's stable. And the additional irony of that is that the head of the New Yorker, Harold Ross, and Henry Luce hated each other, like hilariously, deeply, and totally hated each other. And so that was a kind of a delicious irony of that. I will say one thing that didn't make it into the book, and I always intended for it to be an end note, and I just didn't get it in for whatever reason, is that after John F. Kennedy died, Jackie Kennedy and Hersey corresponded, and she apparently told him that John Kennedy loved that profile that Hersey wrote of him so much that he would ask Jackie to read it to him while he would go to sleep at night.
Wow. Well, that profile really played a role in making John F. Kennedy's career.
Yeah.
And taking this kind of spoiled son of a wealthy financier and making him and wealthy, his father had Nazi sympathies. So turning John F. Kennedy into a war hero, it really helped launch his political career. And it's amazing how Hersey, turns up and has this effect. What was the American reaction to the destruction of Hiroshima? I mean, my father was in the Navy. He was about to go to the Pacific, and he felt like maybe his life had been saved by the.
And maybe it had.
And that was at the time. And I'm wondering, what was the official view and what was the mainstream view of the atomic bombs and of Hiroshima, and what made Hersey think, well, that's the next story I've got to tell, and I'm drawn to that?
Well, I mean, the mainstream reaction was people were ecstatic. I mean, it had ended the war. Not only had it ended the war abruptly, and it had, as per the official narrative, spared not only, hundreds of thousands of American lives, but even Japanese lives. Not like, Americans cared about that, but it was part of the whole justification and narrative. And there was a poll that was taken in August of 1945 that said that I think close to a quarter or a third, I need to go back and check the numbers, but I think it's close to a quarter of those who were polled said that they actually wished that the US had been able to drop many more atomic bombs on Japan. before they had officially surrendered. So I mean, there was pure vengeance. And when President Harry Truman made the announcement that Hiroshima had been devastated by this bomb, he said, Japan has been repaid manyfold for its attack on Pearl Harbor. And so it wasn't just about the ending of the war. It was pure vengeance. Also, this feeling of like, you brought this on yourselves because you attacked us first. And so now we are paying you back 100 times over. One reader later wrote into the New Yorker in the wake of Hersey's reporting on Hiroshima and said that, he too had experienced what he thought was the pervasive 4th of July attitude towards the bombing. And so Hersey, so one of my Hersey didn't leave a big paper trail. Hemingway, he's everywhere. There are 500,000 letters about what he ate for breakfast, on any given day. Hersey was harder. And so one of my challenges initially was, how am I going to find out where he was on the day of the Hiroshima bombing? How did he find it? So I found that an academic had interviewed him in the 1960s, had interview notes with him, and had never been published. And I miraculously was able to get those. And they revealed that, Hersey revealed that he had been listening to the radio in New York. He'd been out in Long Island, probably on some holiday. And he hears Truman's radio address. And his first reaction is, it's horror, but he's also thrilled, because he recognizes that this is a mega weapon. This is something totally new. But at the same time, he's like, it probably did shorten the war. And he had been in the Pacific. He had covered battles with the Japanese. And he said that he had witnessed firsthand their tenacity in battle. And he believed, like everybody else, that they would fight to the last man if they needed to. So he was horrified, but relieved. And then he said that his feelings changed 3 days later with the news of Nagasaki, because he said that he felt that not enough time had been given to the Japanese to figure out what the hell had happened to them. They didn't know what had hit them. And he thought that it was, in his words, he thought that it could have been a war crime. And he said that he knew then that he was going to write about the bombs. He had a sense that something huge had happened, not just with the civilian destination, but something major in history was being experienced in that moment. As you pointed out, maybe something as big is the biggest thing that's happened since the birth of Christianity. I would fully support that. So he knows he's going to write about it. At that point, he just doesn't know in what capacity. And that's in August of 1945.
Now, the United States had just been destroying one Japanese city after another. And with firebombing, basically, napalm and other types of firebombs, and had killed many more people, for example, in firebombing Tokyo than in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. What was the significance of destroying a city with an atomic bomb as opposed to what we were routinely doing? I mean, we probably killed perhaps 1 million people in Japan through firebombing.
Yeah, it was a extremely high number. I think Tokyo's the single firebombing, one night firebombing of Tokyo, I think is estimated to have killed around 100,000 people. And look, Hersey, when he came into Japan eventually to start his reporting, I mean, he had to go through Tokyo. He saw flattened Tokyo. And he was used to ruins. Again, he's seen ruins all the way across Europe and around the world. And he said, when he got to Hiroshima, though, it was so psychically disturbing to him in a way that all of the other decimated cities, including Tokyo, had not been to him, because it had been done by one single, what he called in his first draft of Hiroshima, one single primitive bomb. It was the second nuclear weapon that had ever been detonated, and that had absolutely leveled the city and incinerated, tens of thousands of people instantaneously, created firestorms, tornadoes. I mean, it was one small bomb. And so he said that when he later recalled that when he walked into the city and that was no longer just an intellectual an idea, and he was seeing the effects of the bomb. It just washed over him. And he said he just felt a feeling of terror the entire time he was on the ground there reporting out the story.
Yeah. mean, what had happened was mass murder had become amazingly economical and efficient, because to destroy Tokyo, you need hundreds of bombers dropping tens of thousands of bombs.
Yeah.
And to destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one plane, one bomb, and
It's very cost cutting, isn't it?
it's American efficiency. What was the kind of cover up that he had to pierce in order to tell the real story of Hiroshima? What was the government telling the world and telling Americans, and what was our government not telling the world?
I'll try to compact this answer. The long and the short of it is that initially, even though the Americans and Harry Truman's initial announcement really announced the nuclear bombs as mega weapons, they were really doing it in terms of conventional strength. And so it was, this bomb, it's brand new and it unleashes the power of the sun, but it's 20,000 tons of TNT. So they're constantly putting it back into the framework of a conventional mega bomb. What they're not mentioning is, the radioactive aftermath and the fact that this bomb has, is the weapon that goes on killing long after it's been detonated. And nor is the government mentioning the fact that its makers really didn't have that much of an idea. They didn't know that much about the bomb that they had created, and its after effects on human beings, survivors. So there were enormous pains taken by the US government to suppress reporting coming out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki pretty much from the get-go. Hersey was not the first person to try and report and successfully report on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, obviously these were going to be huge journalistic prizes. And so there were quite a few journalists, war correspondents who were embedded. They wouldn't have called it that then, but we call it that now, embedded with Allied forces who were coming into Japan ahead of the occupation. And, for them, they knew that they wanted to be the first into Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we have one guy on the ground there who's half Japanese, half American, who had been stuck there for the duration of the war. He's the first to get into Hiroshima. He reports not only that the whole city has been decimated by a single bomb, but that there's a sinister something that's happening there. People are dying horrible deaths afterwards. The doctors can't figure it out. They're still thinking at this point that maybe it's gas. Maybe the bomb gave off a really sinister kind of gas, because that's what World War I was about. They hadn't realized yet that they'd shifted from a war of chemistry to a war of physics, right? And then, a really tough Australian correspondent, Wilfred Burchett, gets in, and he gets into Hiroshima through subterfuge, which was another almost like out of a spy thriller. And he reports back through the London Express that there's what he calls a sinister disease X. Again, they still don't have information about what the disease X, but it's clear that there's something off and terrible about the bombs and the radioactivity that they're giving off, although they wouldn't have used that yet. So once these initial devastating reports start coming out, and there's another one of them that's intercepted, US government is like, oh, you know what, we already, the war secretary at one point had said, we don't want to get the reputation for outdoing Hitler in atrocities. We've already decimated Tokyo in this completely brutal way. I mean, we've just won this unequivocal moral and military victory over the Axis powers, and now all of a sudden we have this potential PR disaster. This is a largely civilian population. Another major consideration for the US government at that point is that for them to suddenly have America thinking that there's this long-term sinister after effect of the bomb in Japan is not good, because they're about to move tens of thousands of Allied troops into occupation Japan, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these are the boys who the bombs were detonated to spare. And then, all of a sudden they're going to just move them in there. So the US government sends over a team of Manhattan Project physicists and doctors, and the mission to explore Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the mission is clear. You are to clear this for habitation. And say that there's nothing left. The bombs were detonated high enough that there's no radioactivity. So it is cleared. They move tens of thousands of troops in there. And in the meantime, they corral all of the Western journalists into what one of them called a press ghetto in Yokohama, until the entire country could really be secured and journalist movements throughout the country could be closely controlled.
Yeah. I mean, the radiation effects, absolutely, you could see why they'd want to cover it up. I mean, it's really freaky and it's really unsettling. I mean, an atomic bomb is like any other bomb in the sense that it creates a blast wave that knocks down a wall or a building. It creates a fireball that sets things on fire like other explosions. But, you know, in Hiroshima, people thought they'd survived the bomb. They felt just fine. And then a few days later, maybe a couple of weeks later, they're not feeling so good. And then they're really not feeling so good. And then the death by radiation poisoning is horrific. And there's absolutely nothing that you can do for someone who's gotten a fatal dose of radiation. So it's almost a weapon effect like out of a horror movie. And, you know, it makes sense to me that that's what the Pentagon would want to cover up, because it's, especially when it's civilians and women and children who are feeling it.
Well, I mean, Eric, if I could leap in, I mean, at one point we have General Leslie Gross, who gets hauled in front of Congress to say, you know, to talk about what's the true nature of the bombs that we've created and have been detonated in America's name. And he, you know, at this point, he's backing away a little bit from the fact like, oh, there's no radiation. This is a conventional mega bomb. And he's conceding that there is, you know, radiation, but he says, literally says that radiation poisoning is, quote, a very pleasant way to die. Yeah, so I mean,
it's really about as horrific a way to die in reality. I mean, it's just, anyway. So Hersey goes there and speaks to people, and ultimately, and pretty soon I'm going to open this up to other people's questions. The literary model for Hiroshima is a novel, and
Yeah.
what made him choose a novel? What novel was it, and what was it about that novel that seemed so suitable for this beautiful, brilliant work of literary nonfiction?
I'm just looking down here to see if my first edition of said novel is right here. Hold on. Is this it? Yes, this is it. It's The Bridge of San Luis Rey. Can you see this? And so Hersey and his New Yorker editor, after he leaves Time Inc., they decide that he's going to go on a major post-war reporting trip to Asia, starting in China, to talk about, you know, the after effects of the war there and the rise of communism there. And then he's going to kip over to Japan and do this, you know, this devastating report of what the bomb did to human beings, not just the destruction, but human beings. Now, the big challenge for Hersey at this point is, you know, how it's not just how am I going to get in and how am I going to do the reporting. There are those very logistical challenges that he's going to have to stare down, but also he's like, how am I going to tell this in a way that makes people read it? Nobody wants to read it. Nobody wants to know the truth. It's too horrible, first of all. Second of all, it points out that, you know, America did this to civilians and children. I mean, it's Americans were going to have every reason not to read whatever report he came out with. And what he did is he created a novelistic report that made it into must-read reporting, as opposed to, you know, avoid at all cost reporting. And so when he was in China and in the sort of ancillary part of his trip, he got sick at one point, and he was on a I can't remember, a landing, what do you call it? He was on a freighter, and the sailors he had a terrible cold and fever, flu, something pneumonia-esque, and some of the sailors on the boat brought him books from the ship's library, and the book that made the aha moment was The Bridge of San Luis Rey. And in this book, it documents, you know, a handful of people who were all on like a little bridge that snapped, and they all died on the bridge. And so it was, you know, what brought each of those people to that shared moment of disaster, as Hersey later put it. And he thought, you know, that's a really interesting structure for my reporting. So what I will do is I'll go into Hiroshima, I'll find, you know, a handful of average people, and what were they doing the day of the bombing? What was the lead up to that moment? What happened to them in the moment of that bombing? And then what happened to each of them in the aftermath? And he thought that you know, one of the common denominators would have to be that their lives had overlapped before the bomb, and that they, you know, all kind of knew each other to sort of show a community. And so it really gave him a way to to tell the story in a completely beguiling way. And it was very cliffhangery. And because he knew then that he was going to choose, these sort of, what Americans today would call, regular folks, protagonists, that it would draw people into the minutia of their lives. And in a way that, when you're just explaining the physics of the bomb or the physics of radiation or the medical effects of it, that kind of stuff, it can be ignored more easily. But when you're telling, this, when you're rolling out this kind of minutia, human level storytelling, it became beguiling instead of repellent.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I think it's an absolutely brilliant narrative structure. It's incredibly well assembled. It provides multiple perspectives on exactly the same event. There's all kinds of time shifts, and it's just, again, it could be about a horse race or something. It's just beautifully written and beautifully structured. And for me, one of the reasons I can reread the book is that it's about one of the worst tragedies mankind has ever inflicted on one another, this brutal annihilation of civilians, but it's oddly not a depressing book. There's a kind of a humanity in it, and ultimately a hopefulness in it, because he makes this decision, and I don't want to give away for people who haven't read it, but a lot of the people he writes about survive. And so it's a story of survival and of the human spirit as much as it is about the destruction of innocence in this city. So
that's a very big theme with Hersey. He's fascinated by the human drive for survival in the worst of circumstances. And I think that's maybe one of the things that really pulled him through World War II. It wasn't like just an intellectual mining of that in different circumstances, and from concentration camps to Hiroshima. But I mean, his fascination with that impulse is totally, it's present all the way through his entire body of work. I have to say, Eric, I had a different reaction upon the first time of reading Hiroshima. I mean, I do see it as it's hopeful in the sense that there even could be survivors of nuclear attack. But I mean, I thought I was raw after reading this.
Yeah, I mean, I found it emotionally devastating, but I do think it's ultimately life affirming. Anyway, and to just wrap up, so how old is Hersey when this is published? 75 years ago. And what was the date of publication?
So Hersey's report, what he ultimately did, he picked 6 protagonists, again, regular folks, a young widow with 3 kids, a young female clerk, a young medic, a German priest who happened to be living in Hiroshima. And, his account of those 6 lives came out in the August 31st, 1946 issue of the New Yorker. And so it was just, they just missed the 1 year.
Yeah.
The 1 year anniversary of the bombing.
And we just missed the 75th anniversary.
I didn't miss it. That's what this was pegged to. I had to work like crazy to get this book out for that anniversary. I mean, I didn't sleep, from 26, like most people. I didn't sleep from 2016 to 2020. But the interesting thing is, so when Hersey and his editors were preparing the manuscript, originally it was supposed to be pegged to that 1 year anniversary, and they're looking around and they're like, what if somebody else is doing something? What if somebody else scoops us with some, incredible and harrowing report? And they did not need to be worried. I can't remember. I think it might have been Time Magazine wrote the shabbiest, like page 16, 2-paragraph write-up of the anniversary. And it says it was like the most falsified thing you've ever seen in your life. It was like, people in Hiroshima, they're all back. It's they marked the day with like a huge sale and a lantern dance, and everybody rushed to the local stores for sales that were happening there. There were no local stores standing there. Everything was still kind of a smoldering ruin. People were still living there, in abject poverty, using broken teacups, from the ruins of their houses. And, so that was the kind of competitive reporting that Hersey and his team were up against. And then he, 2 weeks later unleashes this what is considered today to still be the most powerful and influential work of investigative journalism ever released.
And it's recognized as that immediately. And again, how old is he when this thing hits the newsstands?
32. Yeah, he's a baby. And another thing that I was interested in looking at when I went into this is how did his press competitors regard this? I mean, were they, and because they were so scooped on this, and most of them were shockingly gracious. Even the major news outlets like the New York Times or AP, I mean, everybody had a Tokyo bureau there, and this was in some ways it was a low-lying fruit story. Not that anybody could have told it, just anybody could have told it the way Hersey did, but somebody else could have told a version of the story, and they didn't. The fact is, Hersey told it for the New Yorker magazine, which had started just 20 years earlier as a humor magazine. So not only did he scoop all the big boys, he broke it in the most comparatively unlikely of press outlets.
And what was the response when the article hit the newsstands?
I mean, Hersey, he's usually so careful about his words, but in this case, he said it was explosive. He had left town altogether. I mean, and he left his editors to kind of field all of the press response. But I mean, it was an avalanche of press response. I mean, it was a worldwide sensation. And I think something like no fewer than 500 radio stations were simultaneously covering it. It was, if people, you couldn't excerpt. If you were a publication, you couldn't excerpt it, you had to rerun it in its entirety, and many publications did, which was no small consideration because of still wartime, post-war paper inhibitions. And people who couldn't run it in its entirety, editors who couldn't run it, were still covering it in editorials on the front pages of newspapers. There were profiles of Hersey. ABC News had it read, ABC Radio then had it read over in almost in its entirety over 3 nights. It was excerpted and discussed everywhere from Jerusalem to South America to, Asia, Europe, everywhere. I mean, so it couldn't have been a bigger international sensation. And, ironically,
one of the other books I can think of that had that impact would be Uncle Tom's Cabin or Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and those are both novels. It's hard to think of a work of nonfiction that so immediately has just a huge international impact.
It was also considered a classic right away also. I mean, because it was made into a book almost immediately upon the release of the article. And it's worth pointing out that this isn't just, a small article. It was a 30,000 word article. Like if these days, by comparison, if you're reading a Vanity Fair or something, most of the articles are like between 5,000 and 6,000 words. And those are considered to be whoppers. They're huge. So this was what one editor described to me as an unprecedented editorial splurge. And so, when it's released, the Library of Congress comes to Hersey right away and they say, can we have the original? We recognize this as an American classic. And Hersey's like, sorry, I gave it right away to Yale, his alma mater. Yale, in the meantime, had been so excited to get their hands on the manuscript that they put out a press release about it. So it's hard to imagine something coming out in today's environment and having that kind of ubiquitous reception. Hersey, it could have really gone badly for Hersey, because even though he's not ever addressing the should we or shouldn't we question, his book is not a referendum on should we have dropped the bomb or not. His book is literally, this is what the atomic bomb does to human beings. This is what it did in Hiroshima. It's just straight reporting. But he knew he was about to seriously anger a lot of people, or because he would be implicitly calling into question the decision to drop the bomb and potentially marring, the US's unqualified moral victory over Japan. So at first, I didn't think that much of his decision to go out of town when it came out, but just seeing the reaction to my own book, which is about Hersey's book, which is not about neither of the books is a referendum about the bomb dropping, but just seeing the anger 75 years later at anybody who dares to imply that it might not have been necessary to incinerate a 90% civilian population. I mean, it's overwhelming now, and I can't even imagine what he must have been up against. But for the most part, it was overwhelmingly positive, and people felt that he had served the common good in not just showing what had happened in Hiroshima, but really what he had done is he had shown the true implications of having entered into the atomic age, and that, you know, nobody was exempt from those implications. You know, at this point, America still had the nuclear monopoly, but they wouldn't forever. Everybody knew it. And then so people in New York are reading this and they think, well, we could be the next Hiroshima. People in Dayton, Ohio, we could be the next Hiroshima. And so all of a sudden, it's like his reporting wakes everybody up to, okay, so this is our new normal. This is the new reality. And, you know, up to that point, it had just been like a largely suppressed wartime story that had belonged to the previous chapter.
And I just have one last question, and then I'm going to shut up and just read out other people's questions. But why is this story and this book relevant today? Why isn't this just a really interesting historical tale? What is it about it that connects to what's happening right now in the world?
Well, I mean, for two reasons. I mean, and first of all, this was a Trump era book. It was conceived in that era, again, is when you know, our press corps was under unprecedented attack, and now faces for many different reasons, existential threat. And so if you have any doubts about, you know, why our free press and why our journalists are essential, then please read my book. Because John Hersey may have helped save millions of people through his reporting by revealing the truth about nuclear weapons. And secondly, I mean, it really underscores a threat that's never been resolved to us. You know, I mean, and this is something that your reporting and my reporting have in common, Eric, and that is that, you know, nukes are the forgotten existential threat. And, you know, and right now we're grappling with the onslaught of climate change, and we're, you know, grappling with a global pandemic still. These are, you know, highly pressing existential threats, but, you know, the nuclear threat keeps ratcheting up. And John Hersey showed the world what it is like to be under nuclear attack, and what that actually looks like. There's no, he humanized that. He brought home the horror in a way that any person, whether you're a bricklayer or a tech worker or, you know, a stay-at-home mom, anybody can understand what is at stake with managing the nuclear threat. And so, you know, the book reminds us what's at stake. And it's the shocking thing is when you remember that the bomb that Hersey is documenting and the destruction that he is documenting was, again, the second bomb ever made, and we now have 13,500 nuclear warheads around the world, enough to destroy civilization many times over. That this is not a threat that's going away. And if anything, as you and I have discussed several times in the lead up to this, it's escalating right now. And so I hope to, through this reporting and through continued reporting, help to draw attention to one of our most pressing existential threats at the moment.
Unfortunately, we agree about that. I wish you were wrong. Okay, the first question I'm going to read out is from our host, Kate. Was the public outraged once they learned all of this in Hiroshima, or did the book just foster more patriotism?
Thank you, Kate. I think it did both. You know, I think it fostered outrage in the sense of, what else have they not told us, you know? And there were calls for accountability, but it also had, you know, it created also a visceral fear of the weapons. I think, you know, the weapons could have been, nuclear weapons would have been more cavalierly used as part of the arsenal. And we have, you know, evidence that, you know, Harry Truman and, you know, subsequent presidents, you know, Eisenhower did regard them as usable parts of the arsenal. But what Hersey's reporting had done was in creating a public knowledge of how truly devastating these weapons were. He had helped make them harder to deploy, like, let's say in Korea, instead of sending troops. You know, but on the other hand, and this was actually, so Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, actually perversely supported the publication of Hiroshima because he felt, now if Hersey and his editors wanted readers to read it and put themselves in the place of the Japanese at that point and be horrified by the prospect of war, and perhaps call for elimination of nuclear weapons or banning of nuclear weapons, what Leslie Groves was hoping is that feeling of empathy or being like, this could be New York or this could be Dayton, would actually work in the favor of expanding the nuclear arsenal, because he thought Americans would get so scared by the prospect of nuclear war that they would have to have what he called the biggest, the best, and the most. And so the reporting also, may have also had the effect of helping to accelerate support for nuclear superiority, and therefore, eventually an arms race once Russia gets into the nuclear weapons game. So it was a combination of reactions. Hersey himself believed that his reporting had ultimately acted more than anything as a deterrent to future use of the bombings, because of the visceral associations that people had with the Hiroshima devastation.
I agree with him. I mean, there was something that academics talk about, which is the nuclear taboo, which is the reality of Hiroshima.
Yeah.
And once people become aware of it, helps us set aside these weapons as something that you can actually use in battle, and they become more symbolic. A question here from John Pope. Leslie, you've also written you've also written recently about downwinders for National Geographic. Are there other nuclear related stories that you'd like to tell?
Well, first of all, hi Don, I owe you an email, and thank you for bringing up that story, because it has completely consumed me for the last few months. So the story that I just wrote was about, it was sort of a bookend for me to Fallout, and it was about American civilians who lived around the Trinity test site in New Mexico in 1945 and were not warned in advance about the first nuclear test that took place there on July 16th, 1945, nor were they evacuated afterwards when it was clear that, devastating fallout had fallen across the state. And they were actually never told what had really happened by the government. In fact, they'd been blatantly lied to. The government told them that an ammunition magazine dump had exploded on a local airbase. And that's what had created this sort of end of the world bombing experience that they had all witnessed. I mean, there was literally fallout falling like snow from the sky for days throughout areas of New Mexico. So it's one of several stories that I've wanted to tell. That one was especially important to me because there was an urgent news peg for it. For some reason, the Trinity downwinders, as those civilians and their descendants call themselves, have never been included in existing legislation that compensates other downwinder communities, say in Nevada and other parts of the country, and western part of the country. And so New Mexico members of Congress are right now making a bid in both the House and the Senate to extend that legislation to include the Trinity downwinders. And they have very little time to get this done because the legislation is about to expire. So there was like a TikTok component to that reporting. And, I brought it to National Geographic because not just because they have, 250 million people following them on their social media channels, but also because, they're a publication that considers it wasn't just a political story to them. It was, environmental, human civilization effect on, it was a very scientific and environmental story as well. And I knew that they would really do well by it, and they did. Other nuclear stories, there are a lot, and Eric, you and I can talk about this too, because I'm sure you've had this experience. I find it incredibly difficult to place nuclear stories with mainstream news outlets, to my extreme frustration.
Yeah, it in so many minds it's archaic. It's something that was relevant in the 80s and the 70s, but doesn't really matter anymore. And it's a real challenge to pierce the denial that is not only official, but among ordinary people who feel like the threat went away when the Cold War ended. Another question from John Pope. You describing Hersey and his editor planning long-term projects like what eventually became Hiroshima sounds so alien to the way that much news is written nowadays. The large-scale public reaction when it was published seems even more alien. Do you think this type of reporting is still possible? If not, do you think there's a way to get it back?
Well, Eric, I want to hear you on this too. Yeah, I want to, but I think it is still possible, and we do see, instances of reporting, in the decades since and even today that have changed the world. And so for instance, the New Yorker broke Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and I know this is several decades ago, but that launched the entire environmental movement. When she covered the ill effects of TDT. And then, when we look at the reporting surrounding Me Too, for instance, which again was partly broken in the New Yorker.
Yeah.
And so, that we can't say, that has helped completely change the culture of our country. Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor at the New York Times and Ronan Farrow at the New Yorker. Their shared reporting on this was absolutely seismic. So I do think that that's true. Bob Woodward comes out with a book every year that, has these enormous historical revelations about, the Trump administration that will be the leaping off point for historical investigation for decades, generations. I think one of the challenges, though, even with the Me Too reporting has special staying power in terms of its effect, and it's really rare in under any circumstances in any decade, I think, to be able to have that kind of reverberation from reporting. But I think even with reporting like Woodward's investigative reporting, the challenge is attention deficit right now. And so even the hugest stories there's the queasy effect of here today, gone tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And that I don't have an answer for right now, but other than we have to still keep doing the reporting anyway. And that there will still be, with the biggest and the most consequential stories, with dedicated journalists and historians, we will keep coming back to that point and keep coming back until the point is made from that reporting.
Yeah, I think that you're right on the mark about the significance of the Me Too reporting and it being a demonstration of how journalism can still have a real impact and a lasting impact and a global impact. Because, even in France, where, attitude towards women are very different from in this country, it's had an impact, and certain kinds of behavior have just become unacceptable. And there were stories about, there was routine sexual harassment and there were stories about sexual harassment. And there's just something about that latest round of reporting that just has had a huge impact. And I remain optimistic. I feel very badly, though, for young writers because, the magazine world that I came up in is vanishing, if not completely gone. And it's very hard to find newspapers or magazines that are willing to support long-form, long-term investigative journalism, which is hard to do, which is risky to do, and which takes more money to do than, celebrity journalism. So there's never been, I think, as great a need for investigative journalism as today, because certainly this country in particular is as corrupt as it's been since the late 1890s. But in terms of how to earn a living doing it and how to find outlets to do it, it's a challenge. One more question. Do you feel the series Chernobyl has allowed more openness about people willing to read, see, and hear about radiation horror?
100%. Absolutely. I'm so grateful for the reporting on Chernobyl, the book that inspired it, and then for the series that was created from it. Even though it was a period story, I think it's still brought an urgency to the nuclear landscape that might not have existed otherwise. I know that Chernobyl's success was a factor in Fallout has been optioned for a series and for a documentary also, and I'm sure that the production companies who optioned it have drawn encouragement from the success of that. And I think that there are certain indelible images now from that series that will be, I mean, they're part of the forever Hollywood pantheon of nuclear representations. And so, for instance, that one scene where, you know, right after the reactor blows up and you see all the people in the surrounding communities, and they all, you know, they're all outside and they see the snow coming down, and they bring their babies outside, and it's this wondrous thing for them. And, you know, but you're watching and you know how sinister it is, what they're actually experiencing, that they're all probably going to be dead in, you know, 10 years or 5 years or whatever. I think that it did a little bit of what Hersey did in his book, in his Hiroshima. And by the way, here's a first edition of Hersey's Hiroshima. It did a little bit of what Hersey did in terms of like in showing scenes like that, like what happened to the people, what happened to the children, what happened to the pets in real time, and being exposed to this nuclear disaster. And it reminds people, you know, guess what, that could be you. Oh, you know, aren't there nuclear reactors up and down California? Oh, that could be us. And so, yeah, I think that Chernobyl was hugely helped advance awareness, and maybe, you know, made it easier for subsequent projects to come along, and hopefully will have made it easier for, you would think that it would have made it easier for reporters like us to place important stories. I don't know that we've gotten that far, but it's definitely helped in Hollywood. So if there are any producers from Chernobyl watching this, thank you.
Do you know if Hersey's work was read, and if so, how it was received by policymakers in the aftermath of the Second World War, specifically hawkish theorists like Kissinger, who advocated limited nuclear war?
That's a super interesting question about Kissinger. I don't know, and now I want to know. So I do know that there were policymakers who were inspired to limit nuclear war, and to really, like, you know, William Perry, for instance, our 46th defense secretary, I can't remember the exact number. You know, he said he was directly inspired by Hiroshima and its revelations, you know, early in his career, to make sure that nuclear war never happened again, or do everything within his ability to prevent it. So it really did inspire a generation of activists who were anti-nukes. What the more hawkish 80s guys, you know, like Dick Pearl and you know, Kissinger thought of it, probably it didn't, like, they just didn't care. I mean, by then we knew what nuclear war had, you know, looked like, but it was just part of their calculus, you know, their indifference to the devastation that nuclear war would have caused. Just seemed to be like they were willing to assume that responsibility by then. What you couldn't claim, nobody, whether you were a hawk in the 50s or the 60s or in the 80s, you couldn't claim after Hersey's report came out not to know what nuclear warfare would look like if you were the one to pull the trigger. And so anybody, what Hersey's reporting helped do is it made leaders more responsible in a way for owning the devastation that they would be causing. I mean, there was no claiming ignorance on the true effects of the bombs, especially once thermonuclear warfare gets into the picture, which makes, you know, the Hiroshima bomb look like, you know, a shrinky dink in comparison.
Yeah. What do you think of entertainment, you know, both television and film, and how they've dealt with the journalist as a subject, as well as the issue of nuclear weapons? You know, to the degree that these things have been depicted, you know, have they been done well, poorly?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, Erica, I want to hear your thoughts on this too. I mean, I think it depends on the project, right? I mean, I love All the President's Men. I thought they were that was pretty great. You know, parts of broadcast news were pretty great. I thought the Newsroom, the Sorkin show, was like one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. It made me want to like jab my eyes out with pencils every time I watched it. You know, so it truly does depend on the project. I think I've been fascinated by the apparent continued interest in journalistic process, which, you know, there was one review of Spotlight, and it was like a variety review, and it was really funny. And it said, it called it like a procedural thriller with lots of slamming of file cabinets and that kind of thing. And so, you know, a lot of background reporting, it's hard to depict because, you know, a lot of it's archival, or a lot of it is just calling and calling and calling and calling and typing and microfiching or whatever. And you know, so that cracked me up because, you know, the idea of it being the procedural thriller. But then there are, you know, the more exciting moments. You know, there are, you know, confrontations with sources. There are you know, ethical questions that come up in journalistic excavations, and I can see why they would still be, why they're interesting to audiences, and I think, you know, I'm hoping that that will continue to be an asset to keep generating support for journalists and journalism.
Well, you know,
outlets.
for your book, there seems to be a really inherent cinematic aspect of a 31-year-old journalist going into a bombed out city to find out what really happened there. One of my favorite films about journalism was nominated for an Oscar. It's a documentary that came out this past year, and I was very disappointed it didn't win because I just think it's an extraordinary film. Collective. Did you see that?
I don't even know. Educate me, please. I'm writing it down.
It's a film about investigative journalism. It's a film about investigative journalism in Romania, about these journalists who just start, you know, looking at why people are dying in hospitals and what's going on. And there are so many twists and turns. And it's a beautifully made film, and it's powerful. And I think that, you know, films about journalism can be as exciting as watching paint dry, or they can share in common other genre investigative things, like a detective trying to uncover a murder, or, you know, there can be a similarity when you're trying to figure out the fuck is really going on. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if the stakes are high, it can be quite compelling. But I really urge anyone and everyone who is watching us now to see this film, Collective. It's just incredible. What can the general public do to counteract media's diminishing willingness to get behind long-form investigative journalism?
Again, Erica, I'll ask you to take a crack at this with me too, because it's, I always come at it as a journalist and as a civilian, because I mean, it's just for me as a journalist, when I have a story, it's like just relentlessly going and finding the editor who will champion it. And, you know, so for instance, in the Nat Geo story that I just did on the Trinity Downwinders, that, you know, Erica, as you pointed out, it took a lot of resources to do that story. And, you know, Nat Geo had to create maps. There had to be, you know, more research, you know, there were photos that had to be commissioned. There was, you know, and it was, I luckily had an editor, Oliver Payne, who's an old guard journalist who's been around, who saw the merit in the story, and I needed the champion in-house. And you know, so as a journalist civilian, you know, advocating relentlessly on behalf of stories that you have and you know are important it's deadly important. You know, as a civilian who's not a journalist, I mean, just making demands of your publications that you know subscribe to, and really targeting the ones that do it the best too, and writing to editors, tweeting to editors, you know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, places that still do investigative, ProPublica, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, But they also, as Eric points out, they have to have the resources to do these things. So you have to subscribe to these places, and subscription, gives them money, and making sure that, other people in your circle continue to value journalism and support it as well too, because without the resources, even the best intentioned editors can't commission the kind of work that we're talking about right now.
Yeah. I mean, on an encouraging note, I mean, I agree with you. I think if you want to support this kind of journalism, you got to pay for it and subscribe to the Atlantic and the New Yorker and the handful of publications that are still doing it. And the other thing I would encourage everyone to do is buy books. And
Yes.
one of the really encouraging things is, about 6 or 7 years ago, it looked like books might become obsolete, and that ebooks and new technology would replace them. And what's become clear is that as a technology, the book is superior to reading something online. It's just, I mean, I find with my own books, even when I have a digitized copy that I can search, type in search terms, it's easier for me to find things in a book than it is to find it in a digital version of it. And book sales are really up, and people are really reading. And I think the industry's discovered that when you spend 6, 8, 10, 12 hours in a reading experience, or even days, the book itself becomes almost like a souvenir of that experience, and people like books. So, whereas 8 or 10 years ago, I might have been discouraged or anxious about the future of the book, I'm not feeling that at all now. I think that the book will be with us. I just worry more about the writers, because publishing has become so centralized and so concentrated, and very much like Hollywood, and favoring certain writers and looking for huge bestsellers, that one thing that people can do is buy books, and buy books that are written by young writers who are starting out, buy books by, writers who are writing about important subjects. And you don't have to read the book, just buy it and support the writer, because that's what's going to ensure that we have a vibrant culture and not just, ghost written celebrity tell-alls.
I agree
There's a
wholeheartedly.
place for that too, but I mean, real writers with unique voices.
I agree with that also. And if I could just say one more thing too, this is so easy to do. So if you are reading a book, or you've read an article, an investigative article, or, and you're excited by it, you learn something from it, tweet a link to it, share it with your community, put it on, the Evil Empire Facebook, make sure that you're sharing it, because what you're doing at that point is you're further validating as a consumer this person's reporting, and you're making more people aware of it. And that it's so you never know what's going to go viral also. And your casual tweeting of something might, really have a ripple effect, and help bring certain reporting to the attention of a lot of different people. And it's just, maybe it goes nowhere, but maybe it does something. And the bottom line is that you've shown support for it in public.
Okay, there's one more question, and then I'm going to throw one last one out, and then maybe we'll wrap this up. This is from Joseph. I can't pronounce the surname. How do you square the horrors of nuclear conflict with the deterrence these weapons theoretically can provide, along with the fact that human error has brought society so close to annihilation? Are you for total nuclear abolition, or a radical reduction in our and in the globe's nuclear arsenal?
I mean, I have consulted with many experts who are absolutely for nuclear abolition. I don't know how it's possible, but they say that there is a path to it. I think it would just be incredibly difficult to enforce. And so I don't have an answer for that. I struggle with this constantly. I'm sorry not to give a more satisfying answer, but the fact is I'm unresolved about it.
And the final question is, Is there anything that you want to say that hasn't been asked, or any final note that you want to end on?
I think, you know, I mean, Eric, this is something that I, you know, have wanted to discuss with you, having, you know, read your own work on the subject of nukes, and, you know, something I've been thinking about so much since Fallout came out, and is, you know, people's ability to heed warnings. You know, Hersey's Hiroshima was a warning to the world. And, you know, we've had warnings on climate change. We've had warnings on pandemic ahead of time. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on, I mean, do we have an ability to heed warning? And, you know, to a certain extent, you know, Hersey believed that we did, which I draw an enormous amount of solace from in my darker moments. But I'm curious from your reporting what you think about the question.
I think some of us do and some of us don't. Some of us are vaccinated and some of us are taking horse medicine. And we just have to make sure that as many people as possible are willing to look squarely at the truth and act accordingly. And when I think of, you know, the work that you're doing, and I think of the work that Hersey did, it's really about getting at the truth out of the belief that it's important. And, you know, if you have a good therapist, your therapist is going to want you to confront reality. And in a bigger social and political way, the only way that we're going to survive is if we confront reality. So I'm not optimistic in the sense, you know, optimists think that everything's going to turn out okay, but I'm hopeful, and I choose to be hopeful that it's worth pushing and fighting and doing the work that you do and the work that I do in the belief that it can make a difference. And I think that, you know, just to end on your book shows that this work can make a difference. So, you know, he did it, and we should just keep on trying. Anyway, but this is supposed to be your final word. So I want you to end it. That was very nice of you to throw it back at me, but I want to hear from you to conclude it.
No, I'm grateful to you for having the conversation with me, and I'm a great admirer of your, you know, your investigative work. And I, like you, there's no alternative but to do this kind of work, and to even in moments of doubt about warning heeding, to just say you have to do it anyway. One has to do it. One has to try.
Yeah.
I just feel extremely privileged that I was the one who got to tell the story. I can't believe that in the 7.5 decades that, you know, it lapsed between Hersey's storytelling and my book coming out, that nobody else beat me to the punch.
Yeah.
But, you know, thank God that they didn't. And I hope that you guys enjoy the book, and I'm grateful to you for spending part of your Thursday evening with us.
All right. Well, thank you. And I look forward to your next one.
Eric, thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you to the team at Hollywood Health and Society.
Thank you both. This was fantastic. So fascinating and a little harrowing, and but a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Thank you, Eric, for facilitating, and thank you, Leslie. This was just fantastic. And if you haven't bought her book, we'll give you another plug. Please do. It's absolutely fascinating, and I'll say that word one more time: fascinating. Please, before you leave, we will be putting up a survey for our audience to respond and let us know how they felt about this talk. So please do that. And everyone, please go home, stay safe, stay healthy, and peace be with you all. Thank you.